Thank you. Oh, thank you, Emmanuel. That is so much better than a moment of hate from 1984. That's what they have in mind for us later, I think, but not the people in this room will be subject to that. In fact, I had the privilege just now back there of meeting Lonnie Snowden and his wife Karen, who are Ed Snowden's parents, and it was a real pleasure for me to meet them because I know that it meant the world for Ed in Russia to find out when it came out that he had his father's support on this. I know that from my own, and I wanted to thank him for being that way. I don't know what his prior politics were, and his background, like mine, had involved clearance, just as it did for his son. That was also true for my father, who worked on the Atomic Energy Commission, had a Q clearance, so he couldn't tell me until 30 years later, really, what he had worked on. But it meant a lot to me. I didn't know when my wife and I were eluding the FBI for 13 days after the first publication of the Pentagon Papers. That was the first I knew that my father would know what I'd been doing, and I really didn't know how he'd react. He was a Republican, as an engineer, structural engineer, voted for Nixon twice, he told me, which I wasn't real happy to hear. But so I really didn't know entirely how he would react to this news that his son was a criminal, as I'm about to discuss here. And so I was very pleased when we were going from house to house in Cambridge while the FBI was looking all over the world for me in places I think they'd always wanted to go, sort of the Riviera, Bali, and a lot of junketing going on there, I think. But I was in Cambridge, and I saw my father being interviewed in Detroit and saying, I don't know if my son did this, but I can well believe that he did. It's just what he would do. He believed in, his letters from Vietnam, my father said, had turned him around on the war. And he said, I know Daniel has always believed in telling the truth, and he wanted to save those boys' lives. And his voice broke at that point on the television. And I was very, very pleased to hear that. As I say, knowing his background, although actually he had broken from his father's background. My grandfather and grandmother came from Russia as immigrants because Jews had been emancipated, which meant they were now eligible for the draft, for a 7-year draft. And so he came to America, to a land of freedom, where they didn't have a draft at that point. And once when my father was present when I was mentioned that, and afterwards he said, I wasn't happy with what you said about my father. He said, you made him sound like a draft dodger. I said, well, you know what? That's what he did at that point. But his parents were not Republicans. When they came over, they were Russian anarchists, and their models and friends were Big Bill Haywood, who founded the IWW, the Wobblies. How many people here know? Let me see hands. How many have heard of Big Bill Haywood? Not as many. You can't see too many as I would have thought. How about Emma Goldman? And yay, okay, my grandfather, it turned out, was a lover of Emma Goldman. And that's not a too exclusive club, actually, but I'm proud of it. My grandmother didn't feel quite the same way about it. And as a little Jewish boy growing up in Colorado, actually, with Russian immigrant parents, I was surprised to learn at a point when I got an award called the Tom Paine Award that Tom Paine had been the big hero of my father when he was a boy. He got that from his parents, I'm sure. And Tom Paine said in Common Sense, what virtually triggered, fired up the revolution, nations should have no secrets, because the secrets of courts, meaning monarchical courts, the secrets of courts, like those of individuals, are always their defects. Now, actually, that's a little extreme as a statement, to say no secrets. There are legitimate secrets, in a way, certainly in wartime, obviously, and in certain intelligence matters that certainly I believe that. I was not an anarchist, certainly, or a Republican. I was a Cold War liberal. I was a Cold War Democrat. But when I took a lot of secrecy agreements, I was on the understanding And I still believe that there are legitimate secrets. I can argue with Julian Assange on that, who, even when I asked him, do you think government should have any secrets? And he said right away, yes, that they should have no secrets, no. I said, for example, what do you have in mind? And he said, well, private medical records that they have, for example. It wasn't easy for him to come up with anything else, actually. And in fact, I had an argument with Jake Applebaum, whom a lot of you know, who had pretty much the same attitude, very notion that the government should be transparent. And I said, look, since they're getting all the private information of all of us and keeping the fact that they're doing it secret until now, till soon, and they have all that information, if that got turned out en masse, by digitally, which it could be virtually, that would not be a good thing. That would, because of course neither Assange nor Applebaum believe in total transparency for the individual or for associations, private associations, and the government has that now. So they could deprive us all of any kind of privacy or secrecy, and I think, by the way, that is what they're aiming to do, and they've gotten very far along on it. In any case, I think, I'm pretty sure that Snowden, Assange, of course, and Applebaum were not insiders, and that's very good from many points of view, but also I think they weren't exposed to things that when you look at them, you say, okay, this is better to keep secret at this time for some period of time. Certainly Snowden, Manning, Tom Drake, the other NSA people like Bill Binney, Loomis, and so forth, knew many more secrets than they have revealed or thought should be revealed. And that was true. Most people don't realize it about Manning. For example, they think here's this young kid who, quote, dumped out everything he could. You've heard that cliche almost by now. Totally untrue. He worked in what was called a SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, which meant to me immediately that most of what he was looking at was top secret or higher, communications intelligence, covert intelligence, none of which he chose to put out. Whether or not some of it, I'm sure some of it should have been put out, but he did not put anything like that out, meaning that his work was the opposite of indiscriminate. What he put out was secret or lower, which is a classification that I didn't have time to read, literally, in the Pentagon when I worked there as an official. I said, don't bring me secret. This notice, I just don't have time for it. And when I realized how many crimes were revealed by Manning, I realized, gee, I missed more than I realized by not seeing any of this. And I wouldn't have thought they'd put this amount of criminality, torture, assassinations, 20,000 more civilian deaths than the newspapers had picked up. I wouldn't have thought that would all be at the secret level, but apparently it's become so routine. I probably wasn't in my day, torture, for example. But now, so routine, even though Congress has not yet passed a law or rescinded the laws making that criminal, nevertheless, there it is in secret, and of course, no one prosecuted as a result. By the way, it was, you may or may not have realized that Manning's revelations of atrocities through Julian Assange and through Le Monde were absolutely critical in getting US troops out of Iraq. Now, the neocons would say, well, that's a bad thing. They should have stayed. I didn't agree with that at the time, and I was happy to see them going out. I do not believe that the presence of 10,000 troops there would do any good to anybody or would be preventing the kind of civil war we're seeing now. But in any case, it was the revelation of atrocities in those very cables that were not being prosecuted by the US or investigated even, that put pressure on Maliki that he could not allow troops to stay there without immunity from Iraqi prosecution, since the Americans clearly were not going to prosecute that crime as they are legally, criminally obliged to do. What Manning was revealing from information from 2010 was that not only the previous president, George W. Bush, but the current president, Barack Obama, was absolutely indictable, let's say, before the Hague War Crimes Court, Court of Crimes, since our obligation to investigate any credible threat of torture obliged us to investigate it and to abstain from it and to try to stop it. And in fact, what Manning revealed in the course of thousands of cables, what could not have been revealed by one, was time after time after time, and we're talking hundreds, up to 1,000 here, of American troops properly saying, these Iraqis we are turning over to Iraqi troops will be tortured. And many of them are political dissenters of various kinds who are revealing corruption in the Iraqi government. They will be tortured, or they have been tortured. And in every case, the response was a rote, stereotyped case, obviously revealing a high-level order. Do not investigate further. That was an illegal order. As I say, the Geneva Convention and our domestic laws require that to be investigated, and that goes up to the top, including the commander-in-chief. And I have a feeling that that's one reason they were so upset, let's say, with Manning, that he was revealing crimes of the incumbent administration as well as the prison one. Now, the idea of prosecuting someone for revealing evidence of crime sounds odd, doesn't it? It has a strange ring to it. And the ring is a mockery of the rule of law. The idea that evidence of a crime, a serious crime, torture here, in some cases murder with assassination, that can be kept secret by any one of 1 million or so, 100,000, whatever, people who can stamp that evidence of what Tom Paine would call defects, in this case, criminal defects, and keep that out of court, keep that out of the media, keep that from the public. That's absurd to say that you have a rule of law that involves that. Now, could Congress have made that legal? Well, it hasn't. Could the courts really rule? No such case has actually ever gone to the court. When Thomas Tamm, who was a source for the NSA wiretapping that was going on from 2001 and on for the next 5 years, when he was subject to indictment, investigation and subject to indictment for a number of years, including a couple of years into the Obama administration, it was finally dropped. But I told him, Tom, and he agreed with me, I had mixed feelings about your case being dropped. I know, it's been terrible for you, and you've been, in effect, blackballed from, but I have to admit, I would have liked to see a case go to the Supreme Court and see the prosecutors argue in front of the justices that revealing evidence of a crime is itself criminal. It sounds ridiculous. And I was interested, Tam himself, whose life had been overturned by this terribly, did say, I agree with you. I would have liked to see that argued, although he was glad, in the end, mixed feelings, not to have to go through that. Now, in my case, it isn't just evidence of crime that deserves to be known. There are other defects, in fact, that deserve to be known and will be kept secret by this government or any government that can do it, and any corporation. Any group, any association that can keep such information secret will do what it can to do it. Private ones, any kind, certainly corporations, I'll come back to that. So in my case, actually, the Pentagon Papers, there wasn't really revelation of actual war crimes in the way that Manning revealed, or Ed Snowden revealed, or Thomas Tamm, because Ed Snowden revealed what Tamm couldn't, and that was documentary evidence that the NSA knew that what they were doing in 2001, 2002, 3, 4, 5, until Congress began to try to legitimate it, was clearly criminal, with criminal penalties. So that's what Snowden revealed. Now, were we in fact criminals? Oh, I started to say, in the case of the Pentagon Papers, it wasn't in fact so much a matter of crime, it was high-level decision-making involving what could be argued was aggression, but it would be a complicated argument, unlike George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq. No complication in that one in front of The Hague at all. Clear-cut, crime against the peace, aggression, war criminals of the kind that people were hanged in Germany and Japan. Whatever you think about capital punishment, the point is that in terms of criminality, in terms of appropriate condemnation, stigmatization of doing such a thing, indictment, whatever the sentence is in the end. There's no question that George W. Bush, Cheney, and everybody cooperating with them was as guilty as the people who were tried at Nuremberg and in Tokyo. But that was, now, all of us, as I say, accepted to start with and continued to this day to feel that there are some legitimate secrets, which is to say some things that should not be leaked without authorization, and they're properly held for some period of time. That applies to very, very little that needs holding beyond months, a year or two, really 2 or 3 years. A real expert on this subject, I won't go into it now, named William Florence, who actually wrote most of the regulations on secrecy for the Pentagon, said that about 5% of classified information, as I say, he wrote the regulations, about 5% fulfills the criteria for classification when it's written. And he said 2 or 3 years later, that's about half of 1%. And that's a pretty good estimate, actually. As anybody inside the system, if they think about it, I think will know. It's not that overclassification affects a quarter, a third, a half of what's classified. Think 95%. Or after a couple of years, 98%, 99%. The Erwin Griswold, the former dean of Harvard Law School, who argued the case for injunction of the Pentagon Papers, saying that any further publication of the papers, in this first injunction ever requested by the government, any further publication would harm U.S. national security irrevocably, and greatly. 30 years later, I'm sitting in a panel like this and hear Griswold say, looking back on it, I never believed that any of the material in the Pentagon Papers had any effect on security. I would have loved to hear him say that a little earlier, before I was on trial. But he said, and he made the good comment. He said, I've been in this system a long time, and very, very little deserves classification beyond a short period of time. Meaning, look at, people always bring up the Normandy invasion of 1944. Fine, the date and place of the Normandy invasion. Who would disagree that that had to be secret? And how secret did the billion or so pages relating to that have to be in August of 1944 or July? For a few days, there was a question of, is this a feint? Where are they really coming and so forth? By August of 44, now we're still on, the place of the Normandy landing is really not a very important secret to keep. But it was kept. You can be sure. I don't know. I'd like to see the statistics on this. I would guess that probably most of that was kept secret for the next 20 or 30 years. As a matter of fact, at the end of the war, there wasn't any mass declassification, whatever. And that's very typical. Now, all of us, when I say Manning, Snowden, and I, and Tom Drake actually, had clearances for communications intelligence, for which there is a narrow Official Secrets Act. And of course, communications, that's the big subject here. And generally, I'm sure that when we first signed a secrecy agreement relating to that, we not only thought that's probably right, the need for the public to know this, that we are listening in to these foreign powers for our intelligence purposes, and the fact we are doing it, and the content of it deserves to be kept secret, even for a long period of time. That's what is justified generally, to keep people from changing their codes and being more aware that they have to be more careful against hackers and actually against spies. So, which we don't have here. So it sounds reasonable to us. I don't think that anymore, the way the law is written, and I'll come back to that, because it doesn't allow for a public interest defense. It's a strict liability law, which means, was it classified? Did you put it out? That's it. Away you go. No argument in court, whatever, as to the motives, the public benefit, or the lack of harm that may have caused by putting out this information. You can't argue that. I experienced that myself in the first prosecution ever held for a leak in America, and that was mine. And when, in 4.5 days on the stand, my lawyer asked me, Mr. Ellsberg, why did you... outside the court, the lawyers always called me Dr. Ellsberg to PhD, to irritate the prosecutor. And the prosecutor made a motion that the word doctor should not be used in front of the jury. And the judge says, he agreed with that. He says, no titles in this courtroom, except for mine, of course. And so, Mr. Ellsberg, why did you copy the Pentagon Papers? And I started to answer. I'd been prepared for this for a long time, to tell things that I had actually never told the press before, even though I'd been free to speak in interviews. But I thought I'll save certain things for when I'm testifying under oath. And that will give it an authenticity and a drama that it wouldn't have otherwise. So I was ready to answer. Objection, irrelevant. Motives, not an element of this crime. And the judge upheld that. And my lawyer, Leonard Boudin, tried several other ways of phrasing it. Not motives or not why, but, tell us about this or that or something. Couldn't get it through. And every time he was blocked, as Snowden would be and as Manning was in his court-martial, and Drake. And so finally my lawyer said to the judge, Judge Matthew Byrne, Your Honor, I've never heard of a case where a defendant in a criminal trial is not allowed to tell the jury why he did what he did. And the answer from the judge was, now you're hearing it. And that was it. So the idea by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, by current Secretary of State John Kerry, Snowden should come back here and make his case in court is absolutely hollow. I had the chance to ask Ed, do you think they believed that? And he thought not. I don't know what his basis is. Maybe we can... no, he says, they know better than that. Oh, maybe yes, maybe no. The truth is that not many lawyers know either the law or the bearing of the Constitution on this, because in my case, there never had been a case. They didn't learn about it in law school. They didn't see any cases because there weren't any to cite. So, excuse me. So we come back to this question, was I a criminal? Did I break a law? I asked my lawyer, Charlie Nesson, a Harvard law professor still, about 10 years later, after all this, I said, Charlie, did I break any law? And he said, that's very hard to answer. And here's why it was, and to some degree still is. The reason I was asking in a way was that whereas I assumed I had broken law when I did it, and I assumed that I would go to jail for life on this, we found out in the course of reading that there had been no previous cases. Nobody knew that, actually. If this were an audience of lawyers, well, I'll come back to that. I would not expect you to know that, in fact, that my case was the first. There had been none before me. Or why? Well, according to Mel Nimmer, who was then the leading authority on law of information, which, again, we're dealing with very much here, wrote an amicus brief for the ACLU and then published that as a Stanford Law Review article in 1974. He said, the statutes which Ellsberg is accused, under which he is charged, which included the Espionage Act and theft, either do not apply to his acts, or if so applied, are unconstitutional. And that judgment was backed up by Harold Edgar, Benno Schmidt in 2 magisterial articles, very big articles, one in the next year, and one 10 years later, looking back on it. Same argument, essentially, that to hold revealing information that was classified criminal per se, whatever the motives, whatever the benefits and so on, was an unconstitutional violation of the First Amendment. Now we're talking here about speech by officials. Most of the discussion of the law here has had to do with the press. Does the press have rights? After all, it is named in the First Amendment as being protected, or not? That's the question that's been addressed, and very little has been addressed on what about the free speech of officials? To what extent can that be restrained, because I was on trial for this. Now, actually, nearly everybody nowadays looking at the Snowden case or the Manning case, even my friend and mentor, my hero, Glenn Greenwald, has said repeatedly, and I keep reproving him, but we haven't had a full discussion of it, no one doubts that Ellsberg and Manning, and then later Snowden, broke the law. Well, I've tried to tell him there's more question about that than even Glenn, who's a constitutional lawyer, may realize. Let me mention a number of things that I would not expect anyone in this room even, because I've raised this to judges and lawyers and reporters and now you people, to know, unless you've heard it from me, essentially, because it's just not in the public discussion. Actually, it was alluded to by Jess Radak very well the other day. How many people heard that, by the way? Not everybody. How many did not hear it? Can't see very well. Well, enough did not hear it. Let me summarize. She said it very well, and so did Tom Drake. But I'll just say 7 or 8 things that almost no one knows, even specialists like journalists. 1 point. Of course, there is no doubt that Snowden, Manning, and I, and not Drake, actually, interestingly, but Snowden, Manning, and I broke regulations, broke the secrecy rules, which are, in fact, administrative rules within the executive branch of the government. They've only existed for the last half-century or so, since the early part of the Second World War. Well, actually, Jess said 52. I was a little surprised to hear that. I would have thought that it was during the war, the classification system. But anyway, I'll accept her authority on this, subject to rebuttal. And the regulations are very clear on this, you know, that you can't give classified information, now this is one compartment of it, to a person without clearance, to anyone not authorized to receive it. Now, you can have a clearance and still not be authorized to receive it, but let me focus on the question of giving it to, let's say, a newspaperman or to a congressional staffer or somebody who doesn't have a clearance. There's no question then that that violates the rules. And the rules of any organization are subject you to what are called administrative penalties. The 3 of us that I keep mentioning here did not take a secrecy oath, although it's always described like that. There is an oath we took, an oath being, so help me God, very serious, very grave. Raise your hand. We didn't take that, as I think Tom mentioned a lot, to the secrecy system or the president, but solely to support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And as I've been saying for some years, what Tom said the other day, there are domestic enemies of the Constitution at large, and Dick Cheney is one of them, for example. And I don't mean that as an epithet, because all the presidents I served violated the Constitution. Hardly any question. They all committed impeachable offenses, if that were an impeachable offense, to violate the Constitution. Congress has to decide that they want to go through that or not. They all violated it. But really, Dick Cheney, and I even distinguish him here from Bush. I don't know what Bush felt about it. Dick Cheney and his counsel, David Eddington, had a pretty coherent theory of what the Constitution should be, and was not the one they took an oath to defend. And it was one, but that was especially true after 9/11 when George Bush W. joined them in this belief, which was there is no restraint on the president. He or she is above the law. No treaty like the Geneva Convention on Torture binds him, not the Constitution, not a treaty, not an act of Congress, nothing binds him. In the field of national security, which he defines himself, and during an emergency, which he defines himself. Carl Schmitt, the legal philosopher of both of the Nazi regime and also of the Mussolini regime, defined this. He said, he is sovereign who determines the state of emergency. And we're in an emergency. I suspect that even in this audience, very few people realize that George W. Bush declared an emergency, which seemed very natural, 9/11 appropriate, and that's been renewed every 6 months, including by Barack Obama. We're living in a state of emergency, and legally. And what does that mean? Well, part of it is written out in a law, what the president can do in a state of emergency that he or she can't do otherwise. And part of it isn't. It's classified. And when people on the Homeland Security Committee tried to find out what is in the classified annex to these continuity of government regulations and the emergency regulations, answer, you aren't cleared for that. You can't get it. And the chairman asked for it and can't get it. By the way, that is an absolutely prime candidate for leak. Anybody who knows that in the government, I would say, is absolutely contradicting their oath to defend and support the Constitution when they are party to keeping secret from Congress and the public new executive regulations that amount to suspension of the Constitution. And I believe such orders have been given. Exactly. Any case, as Tom Drake was mentioning the other day, as he realized right away, the surveillance part, mass surveillance of people without a warrant, which they almost surely could have gotten from the federal, they really wanted to show that they weren't bound by a court. The court would almost certainly have given them that authority. But no, Cheney said, no, don't go for it. He didn't want to go for anything to Congress or the courts. We have the authority. That was the principle they wanted to establish. And so for years, this totally criminal operation was going on. Everybody involved in that who did not reveal it to the New York Times or others was guilty of violating their oath. Absolutely. Are there any penalties for that? Actually, I don't know. I'll ask Jess, I'll ask any lawyers here. I've never heard of somebody penalized or indicted or charged with violating their oath to uphold the Constitution. Where would you stop? You'd start with the president and the vice president, but it would go pretty far, pretty wide when it comes to that. But I think they have pretty much immunity in the past, at least from that, and that ought to change. But what we did do was sign a secrecy agreement, a non-disclosure agreement, such as people in the tobacco company sign in any company. In fact, I think my friend Julian Assange asked at one point people in WikiLeaks to sign a non-disclosure agreement. Nothing unusual about that, except you might say for him a little bit. It certainly gets very irritated, when he was leaked on, as does everybody. So it's a funny way to put it. My wife used to hate me. My wife used to hate me being called a leaker. She said it made me sound incontinent. But I've had to get used to it now. It's the word. There is no an unauthorized disclosure. That's not a little too complicated. So we did sign this agreement. And it was an agreement, of course, not to reveal what we learned in the course of our employment. And not dissimilar is what is simply taken for granted between a lawyer and a client. I'm not sure, I'm looking at Jess here, but I'm not sure whether lawyers sign actual agreements. It's taken for granted, right? Like a priest in the confession booth and a doctor and so forth. But in corporations, very commonly. And that was the same kind of agreement, except we were warned in a footnote. Well, no, actually, in the text, it said, and I understand that I might be subject to prosecution, 18 U.S.C. 793 D and E, which I happen to remember because I was the first person actually prosecuted under that ever. And all these other people met that act later, the other whistleblowers. The point is that was a bluff. No one had in fact been prosecuted, although leaks happened, every day, every other day. 50 years had passed since the Espionage Act, 54 years, had been passed in 1917. No one had been prosecuted for a leak because it was regarded as unconstitutional to have what amounted to an Official Secrets Act. So let me go back to my list of things that almost nobody knows. In contrast to most other countries in the world who have some version of a British type Official Secrets Act, an OSA, Official Secrets Act, which criminalizes any and all disclosure without authorization of protected information, classified information. The US doesn't have such an act, intended by Congress to be such an act and having been found constitutional. In fact, and very specifically, the Espionage Act is not such an act. Now, the reason nobody knows this, I said there hadn't been cases, but because it seems natural to people to have such an act. I mean, the British live under it, and most other countries have it, and so everybody assumes, as I assumed when I copied this material and put it out, and incidentally, Mel Nimmer pointed out, as the leading authority then, that I wasn't properly charged with theft in copying this stuff overnight in a corporation that, by the way, was a contractor like Ed Snowden's corporation, the Rand Corporation, and returning it to my safe in the morning after spending all night copying because I was the only person in the corporation authorized to read it. I was not depriving anybody of the use of that document, so even conversion was a very invalid claim against me. And in general, copying in those days was not held to be theft. You didn't deprive the owner, if there was an owner, of the use of the information. I understand that's changed significantly now in the digital age, that you can be convicted of copying in a way that I wasn't, shouldn't have been susceptible to. But coming back to the Espionage Act, the Espionage Act was not intended for whistleblowers. That's clear from the legislative history. But courts nowadays have a trend where they're no longer paying that much attention to legislative history. They say the plain language here we don't care what Congress said at the time they passed it. So the plain language clearly of the Espionage Act we all broke, as we did the administrative regulation. Let what had kept leaks to be as few as they were for those 50 years before my prosecution? And let me check on the time here. How are we doing? Anybody in charge? What? In this group of anarchists, who's in charge? That's what I want to know. Take me to your leader. 5 minutes? Oy, gavol. Okay. I've used up my time. What can I say? Okay, I hadn't seen that. Okay, 5 minutes, let's see. Fat chance. Okay. We'll see. They may be very disciplined here. What do I want to say in 5 minutes? Okay. There should not be a British-type Official Secrets Act in this country. It is a violation of the First Amendment. But it turns out, unlike the founders' attitude towards slavery, which was not to their credit, and which eventually got changed in the course of a war, new amendments, etc., their attitudes on secrecy, on free speech and freedom of the press were very good. The First Amendment, I was thinking, taking time here, but what's the Fahrenheit 451? Isn't that the Ray Bradbury story where people memorized texts to pass them on when the government was incinerating all texts that might aid dissent of various kinds. And I've asked myself, if we get to that situation, and we are on the way to it, what would I memorize? And not being able to memorize anything too lengthy at this point, the First Amendment is what I would choose, and I'll give it to you now to see all the words of that. But the focus has been on free speech, freedom of the press lately, and I want to say freedom of speech of officials deserves a lot more attention than it's gotten. Because if you can choke off the sources by adding to all the administrative punishments that are available, which are more than enough to keep more than enough secrets that should not be kept. That includes firing, losing your clearance, just losing access, no longer being important, losing your career without a clearance. Very often, losing your marriage. very significantly. Losing all your friends, total ostracism of people who have clearances, which tends to be all your friends. If it's in that business, you become typhoid Mary, they can't talk to you at all anymore. That's a rather startling punishment that comes in. Keeps people quiet no matter what the secret. As I said, we all signed a secrecy agreement to keep any and all secrets. But it didn't occur to us, I'll speak for myself, and I suspect for the others, it didn't occur to us how much criminal activity, or in the case of the Pentagon Papers, reckless, murderous, mass murder, unconstitutional behavior was being concealed by that secrecy. And we may or may not have come, as Tom said the other day, to realize at the moment that that was a violation of our oath to the Constitution, but we did know it was destroying our democracy in the case of what Snowden revealed, and destroying many lives as the ongoing war at the time of the Pentagon Papers. Whether what the government was doing was illegal or not, the secrets that kept it going should no longer be secret. And at what was worth doing as a result of that? Well, I'd been in Vietnam a couple of years, driven the roads 10,000 miles, actually, as much as anybody. I'd risked my body, my life, like 3 million other Americans who were expected to do that without any question, without getting psychological profiles done on them by CIA or anybody else. Is it not worth taking a risk of one's freedom, or maybe even life, definitely, to prevent this ongoing war in that case? In the case of Vietnam, or in the case of Snowden, to prevent not just a violation of the Constitution, but a violation that should not be happening because it ate at the core of our democracy. A government that knows every communication between journalists and sources, congressional staffs, every bit of blackmail that can be gathered on the people who fund by budgeting the budgets of the NSA or anybody else, the Defense Department, judges, whoever else. Can you really have independent forms of government at that point? The complaint in the Senate Intelligence Committee that they had been overheard themselves by CIA when they were debating this stuff led to great outrage. Investigation closed, no prosecution, no further. Is the intelligence community really independent when they can be overheard without, without any effect on that, or even when it's found out? Obviously not, and it hasn't been. 2 minutes. It hasn't been. Take, for example, the Intelligence Committee, which has allowed a 6,000-page, Pentagon Papers were 7,000 pages, a 6,000-page study of criminality on torture to be bottled up now for a couple of years and is still in the hands of CIA to decide whether they want us to know what they've been doing criminally at the order of the president. That's absurd. The people who are failing to leak that document to the press and to WikiLeaks, to expose facts or whatever, are not just violating the Constitution. They do that every day in their jobs. They are, in fact, however, complicit in mass criminality here of a very serious sort. So, I've got 1 more minute, so I will use it on one more leak we need. Without more whistleblowers, rather than less, which is what the Barack Obama administration is working very hard to achieve, less to no whistleblowers. We need more whistleblowers, very definitely, in the government, no question about that. And you people have to do what you can to make it possible through secure drop, through exposed facts, through new codes and ciphers, to make it possible for people to do this without spending their life in prison, without spending 35 years in prison like Manning, or being totally oppressed financially like Tom Drake, and without having to go into exile. Granted, exile better than prison, as Snowden says. Nevertheless, that shouldn't have to be the price, and you are the people who can make it possible for our democracy to survive that attack on whistleblowers by allowing anonymity. But it's not only the government. As I say, democracy, I don't think, can survive an effective Official Secrets Act, as the president is now doing. He is using, for the first time, with 3 previous exceptions, for the first time the Espionage Act as if it were a United Kingdom Official Secrets Act, something that Congress had not allowed except once. Another fact you haven't heard, but Congress did pass such an act in 2000, in the last months of Clinton's administration, and Clinton vetoed it on the grounds that it was unconstitutional. So, and we don't have it yet. But Obama now has discovered that with the current courts and so forth, he feels he can get away, and he has gotten away so far, with using the Espionage Act, Strict Liability Act, as if it were a British Official Secrets Act. Okay. Our survival as a species depends on, as a species, that's going to sound hyperbolic right away. Wait till you hear what I'm talking about. Depends on the public being informed that there really is climate change and that it really is man-caused, human-caused, something that something like 30 to 40% of the American people don't believe at this point because they have been lied to and manipulated by the gas, oil, and coal companies who support companies whose product is doubt. And they've succeeded in selling that product. I am certain that there are documents inside each one of those companies, Exxon, Mobil, Shell, the coal companies, that show that they know perfectly well what's happening and what they are doing and what they propose to do in the way of producing and burning coal. And that you don't have to rely on James Hansen, who's given up his job and is doing civil disobedience, to try to get that through to people. You could have documents, just as Merrill Williams and Jeffrey Wygand, 2 people, exposed from the tobacco companies, proving that they were lying when they said under oath that they did not know that their product was carcinogenic, addictive, and that they were selling it to minors. That was the basis for all the class action suits since then, which in this country have saved hundreds of thousands of lives, more than all of our wars put together, except the Civil War. Didn't save lives abroad because the tobacco companies are busy making even more profit selling it to the third world, but it did have an effect here. And I'm saying people inside Exxon, Mobil, and the others, absolutely, they won't even be subject to prosecution, just to the ostracism and the loss of income and everything else. If they reveal to us, if they leak to us, the knowledge by their bosses of that they are ending civilization within, if it's the next 30 years or the next 200 years, that they are earning it by doing it. I'm sure that's what their analyses, and of course it should be out. And yes, the people in those corporations need your help too. Even though it's not classified, they need anonymity. You can give it to them if you work at it and save the world. And that's what we're all up to, right? Thank you.
Wow. Daniel Ellsberg. We are going to take about a 10-minute break, but I strongly advise people not to leave their seats because there's no guarantee it'll be there when you come back. When we come back, we're going to tie in to Edward Snowden, and we'll start the conversation and see how that goes. Scheduling, we're going to, I imagine you probably want us to do the whole thing and run half an hour late, then be on time and cut it short, right? Yeah, okay. I suspected as much. So everything will probably be about a half hour delayed in all tracks. So just note that on your papers or whatever. Oh, also this note, we just found out we're #1 on live stream right now. not too surprised, and that's only going to go up. We have thousands of people streaming around the world thanks to our awesome 10 gigabit connection. And by the way, our slogan, use more bandwidth. Come on, we have so much of it. This has never happened before. So hang tight for about 10 minutes or so, and when we come back, we'll make more history. Thanks. Okay. Everybody settle down? Can we just have a little bit of silence for a moment? I just want to say hi to all the people in Serpico. Can you hear us in there? No, you're not in Serpico, you're in Manning. This is Manning where I am right now. And Serpico, give us a loud cheer. Okay, all right. And you folks way in the back in Olson, can you hear us? All right. They're a little closer. You guys down on the first floor, how about you? Well, I hear something. Okay. There are people on the first floor at the entrance to the hotel spilled out into the street right now. I'm not kidding. There are taxis queuing up. It's a whole big, it's a good mess though. It's a good mess. Okay, so I know there were some of you who felt you didn't applaud enough for Daniel's amazing speech. Here he is again. I also would like to introduce Trevor Tim from the Freedom of the Press Foundation, founder of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He's going to be here. He will have selected some questions from Twitter that you guys have submitted. And I guess this is a good time to remind people on the press, this is not a press conference, so the questions we're going to ask Edward later come from our attendees, and hopefully there'll be questions that you're interested in as well. Please just follow our guidelines and everything will be cool. And that's, oh yes, I almost forgot. We have a third panelist who will be joining us from Russia, one of my real heroes, and I think many people in this room, many people in the hacker community, many people in America. Edward Snowden, welcome. Hi, guys. How is it over there? Good to be back in New York. Can you hear me now? That last part was actually for the FBI. That wasn't for you guys. I'm hoping we can help them pad out the indictment tonight. So I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing the stage, but I think I can hear Dan's microphone. I want to start out by saying to Dan Ellsberg, thank you for everything you've done, for all of your service, both in the government and outside of the government. Everything you did for us as a nation, as a society. You have given so many, so much, and told us the truth about what our government was doing at a time when the truth was very hard to get. And I have to say, I watched a documentary about your life as I was grappling with these issues myself. And it had a deep impact and really shaped my thinking. So thank you for everything you've done.
Ed, I see you've shaved since I last saw you. And I have to tell you, you didn't have to do that for this audience.
Well, luckily, I've got plenty of black T-shirts. But I do not have the Keith Alexander brand dad jeans. I'll save those for DEF CON.
So I'm going to try to stay largely out of the way and let these guys talk, but I think there's a few topics that we'd like to cover. And to start with, I was hoping Dan could describe what it felt like the first time he heard about Edward Snowden, his feelings on hearing his name and seeing what he had given the world, and if his feelings have changed since and how he's grown to feel about Edward Snowden?
I can tell you exactly what I felt. Hope, actually, which had not been in great supply for me recently. When I saw this name of this conference, I had mixed feelings about it. My feelings of hope go up and down a little, and they haven't been too high. And there's no question, I felt that when Chelsea Manning was revealed. I used to ask in a way, how often do you need a Pentagon Papers, which is a massive disclosure that is unequivocal of documents that really shows, one document doesn't do it, as Ed knows. And they can say, well, we changed that the next day. That was just some particular little department, some low-level person originated that or something. So what you really need is a massive stuff, as in the Pentagon Papers, that shows, no, this is what they said the next day and the day after that, and here was the official policy, and so forth. And I waited 40 years to hear that. And so I was pretty much losing hope that there would be anybody inside who was willing to risk his freedom, his life or her life and freedom, to put out what needed to be put out. Because if you put out a lot of stuff, and I want to get into this with you, Ed, it's technically, you have to be something of a specialist to put out a lot of stuff and not be identified. So I was feeling not hopeful that it would come. And then just 3 years after Manning comes Snowden. So there's no question. I thought it is possible. And in fact, Ed, you once told me that you hoped, among other things, to show that one could do this and be successful. And I'd be interested to hear, actually, from you what your measure, there's no question in my mind you have been successful, but what you had in mind when you wanted to show that people could do this. Because after all, you are out of the country, et cetera.
Well, so there's a lot of things to address there. I mean, that's a big topic, but you said something that I want to respond to first, which was, you kind of touched on technology. You talked about how people recently are specialists. They're able to use specialist skills to gather information that's tremendously important to the public, but we've been denied access to it. And they're able to publish that and get it around the world before anyone's able to stop it, before they're able to kill the story, and before they're able to basically shut the public out of the room of government. You know, they sort of divorce us from our democracy. And the key for me there is that technology empowers dissent. This is something we've seen again and again, and people forget this because they think about it only in modern times. They only think about it at the recent examples. They think about me, they think about Manning, they think about other people who followed in the same sort of thread, but they forget that technology actually enabled you. People forget about the fact that you were, in a garage with a Xerox machine. You know, a copy machine might not seem like a killer app to a lot of people, but that enabled you to get this back to the public. And the same Xerox machine that gave you that gave us samizdat in the former Soviet bloc. And what that tells me, and what I think is important for our society, and I don't just mean in the United States, I mean around the world, is to recognize that technology empowers individuals, it empowers voices, it empowers democracy in a way that can turn one man into a movement or a woman into a world power. And that has fundamentally changed the way that we relate to our government, and more importantly, the way our government relates to us. You know, they say when people fear the government, we have tyranny, but when the government fears people, we have democracy, we have liberty, we have freedom. And I think that's very true, and we see that more and more. When the government has been left sort of in the dark, even when we have whistleblowers who come up and stand up at great risk to bring things to the public, people like Bill Binney, Thomas Drake, Ed Loomis, who end up getting, these guys get pulled out of the shower, naked at gunpoint in front of their families. Their lives are destroyed, their careers are destroyed. They're discredited, they said they're disgruntled. There's these broad campaigns brought against them, but they didn't have hard evidence. They did everything right. They went through the system, and the system destroyed them. The system buried them. And we see this happen again and again. Something very important happened today. A lot of people haven't seen it yet. In the Washington Post, there's an opinion article by a former State Department official who has basically said he's bound by classification. He had to get the article screened by the government to redact any classified information before he could publish it. But the Washington Post ran it, and he basically said, Executive Order 12333, which is one of the Signals Intelligence Authorities, which allows the United States to intercept basically communications that are occurring overseas, is being used to collect incredible amounts of communications, not just on people around the world, not just innocents everywhere, but specifically on Americans, which is precisely what the United States government has said they are not doing. And this is the kind of thing that's illustrative, because what he revealed was explosive. It should be on the front page of every newspaper, but instead it's an opinion article on one newspaper because there's not clear, irrefutable evidence that brings the president to the podium, that brings the Congress to, you know, the press, and says we have to have a national conversation where the public is given back its seat at the table of government, and we as a society are given the opportunity to decide where the lines should be drawn, not a few officials sitting behind closed doors. And I think that is a new power that technology has given us over the last 100 years that is increasing in frequency, strength, magnitude. And if we pair that with a responsibility to use it appropriately, to police ourselves the way our technology grows, and not sleepwalk into new protocols, into new usages, into new applications for these things, but we really think about the implications of putting, you know, ARFIDs in our sneakers and our washing machines and the things we buy at the grocery store, we will have not a dystopian future, but we will have a democracy in which citizens around the world, in every country, are empowered regardless of the policies of their government. And we, at the very minimum, will know the truth of our world and the truth of our governments, and it will not be able to be hidden from us anymore.
So Ed, you mentioned two NSA whistleblowers who came before you, Thomas Drake, who's in the front row here, and Bill Binney, who spoke at the last Hope 2 years ago. And of course, here sits Daniel Ellsberg, the most famous whistleblower in US history. Were you aware of their stories prior to what you did? How familiar were you with the Pentagon Papers and Dan Ellsberg? And did you learn any lessons from them? And are there lessons future whistleblowers can learn from you?
Absolutely. I mean, I followed this closely. I think everybody in the intelligence community did, because what people forget is that, you know, we in the public, we see these stories, they come on the news, you know, the Justice Department, the President, all the talking heads, they say these guys are bad guys, they say they risk the country, they say they're, you know, spies, they've been charged under the Espionage Act, they did bad things. But when you look at what happened, when you look at the bad faith the government used in their case, particularly against Thomas Drake, which eventually collapsed, and they dropped the Espionage Act charges and basically agreed to call it a day. You've got to remember that inside the intelligence community, they're trumpeting these things. They're holding these guys up as examples to say, look, if you say what's going on, if you step out of line, even if you're doing it for the right reasons, even if you're doing it the right way, there will be repercussions. You know, they talk about internal channels and whatnot, but these guys used internal channels. And people like Thomas Drake, they ended up getting indicted. And this is something that I paid very close attention to and I learned a great deal from. And I think it reminds us that, you know, the Founding Fathers, they didn't fight a revolution to have a right to sort of internal processes. The Supreme Court argued this recently. You know, some internal secret policy is not democracy, and that's not checks and balances. That's bureaucracy. If we're going to have democracy, if we're going to have an enlightened citizenry, if we're going to be able to actually provide the, you know, consent of the governed, we have to know what's going on. We have to know at least the broad outlines of our policies, and we can't have the government shut us out from every action, you know, that they're doing. Now, that doesn't mean we need to know the name of every single surveillance target that's out there. We need to know the details of every particular operation against every factory that's here, there, or anywhere. But we have a right, as Americans and as members of the global community, to know the broad outlines of government policies that have a significant impact on our lives. And I think that's something that Tom Drake showed me how to do the right way.
So, Dan, my next question is for you. Oftentimes, Ed's biggest critics often invoke your name, and they invoke it in a positive way and try to contrast what you did with what Edward did. Can you talk about that a little bit? How does that make you feel? Do you agree with them? Do you disagree with them? The most recent was actually Secretary of State John Kerry, who said that you were a hero, but Ed was not. And so, can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. Well, this bullshit in a way started with Barack Obama when somebody actually took the occasion to ask him about Manning here in San Francisco. I was going to say here where I come from, in San Francisco, and said, well, didn't Chelsea Manning, then Bradley, do exactly what Ellsberg did? You know, and well, he could have answered that various ways. What he said was, Ellsberg's material was classified in a different manner. Well, that was true in a way. As I mentioned earlier, everything that Manning put out was secret or less, and everything I put out was top secret. That was the difference. And I think the person asking the question didn't pursue that. And of course, in your case, I'll come back to that, but in your case, higher than top secret, you know, communications intelligence stuff, which I would earlier have said didn't deserve to be put out until you see what it says. And then you see it's evidence of criminality and should not be subject to criminal prosecution for revealing it, even though it is higher than top secret. So since then, that was with Manning, and I found then, that was starting in 2010, that thanks to Manning and now to you, I'm getting more favorable publicity than in 40 years, because suddenly people who were all for putting me in prison for life before now realize that I was really a very good guy. I was the good whistleblower, and so I'm totally, of course, rejected this from the beginning. I didn't want to be a foil for showing up badly to people that I totally admired, you know, and identified with, because there have been lots of leakers, whistleblowers, and I appreciate them all, ones who put out information that should have been known. They're anonymous. I don't know their names on the whole. But the difference here, to me, with Manning and you, was that each showed very clearly, as I had felt 40 years ago, a willingness to put out enough material that was going to really be serious, put us in prison for life. When I read that Manning had said, as I used to say, to Adrian Lamo, the wrong guy to confide in, that he was willing to go to prison for life or even be executed, I said to myself, I have waited 40 years to hear somebody say that. That's the way I felt 40 years ago, and it's taken this long. But so I felt immediately an identification with him. Obviously, in your case, in Manning's case, in my case, we all have different backgrounds. We're different in many ways, but we had the same access, interestingly, you know, comparable, and different kinds of things. So I identified with them, and I couldn't bear to hear me getting good press from the Secretary of State and from others on the grounds that my motives were different. And for example, you mentioned, you know, some of the specifics here. Well, Ellsberg just put out information that was historical, you know, 3 years old at the most recent. Well, that's because I didn't have the most recent. If I had had the current documents, I would not have bothered to put out history. My interest was not in setting the record straight. My interest was in ending an ongoing war, helping to end an ongoing war. And for that, I would much have preferred to put out current documents, which I, at that moment, didn't have access to. Very few people did in the government, even in the White House. It was a big secret what Nixon was really up to, including nuclear threats. And I hoped that my documents would show a pattern that extended into the present. And I failed. Hardly anybody was willing to extrapolate and say, well, Ellsberg has shown that 4 previous presidents lied in the same way, escalated in the same way, made the same kind of secret threats, Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson, but it ended with those. It ended before Nixon. So I thought maybe they'll figure out that maybe the current president is doing the same. No, it took documents, and I didn't have that. So for years, I've been saying to people, it's got to be with documents, even though that increases their risk. Well, people know that basically, but they weren't willing to take the risk, I'm sorry to say, and couldn't do it anonymously. So then Manning came out with his millions, hundreds of thousands actually, of cables, and then you with documents. And it's like Mordecai Vanunu in Israel with photographs that Israel had a nuclear program and even an H-bomb that they weren't willing to admit. And it took those documents which took the risk. So what I was saying is, I saw it right away, without having met you, without having met Manning, that this is someone who I identify with. And at the same time, new heroes. He said, what was my feeling when I heard Snowden's name? I said, well, I have a new hero now. And so thank you.
Thank you. If I could actually follow up on that, I think there's a really important point there that hasn't been real well addressed in the media, and that was you said you acted, not to reveal a specific illegality, but to end a war, to basically correct failures of policies that were costing lives, that were costing us the future of our country at a critical moment where things could be changed, where we could step back sort of from the brink and enjoy a better society. And I think people need to remember that these stories that are being published by journalists, the journalists are working together with their editors, with their institutions, to really analyze whether these things are in the public interest, whether they will benefit us as a society to know, and not publish things that are just gossip or they don't have a significant justification for going into the public domain. Since these stories were revealed, we not only learned sort of the new truth of our world about the fact that all of our communications are being intercepted, collected, analyzed, and stored automatically. And that means that all of our ideas, all of our thoughts, all of our expressions, all of our associations, who we talk to, who we meet, who we love, who we hate, all of these things are now subordinated to the officials, to the policies of a few guys behind closed doors. And we don't know, we can't hold them to account. They don't answer to us. They don't even answer to the full body of Congress. There are only 8 members in Congress, they're called the Gang of 8, who get fully briefed on these intelligence programs. And interestingly, the intelligence community, the intelligence committees that are supposed to oversee these programs, these guys who have access to classified information, they receive more money from actually all of them. Every single member of this committee receives money from the top 20 intelligence companies in the United States. And they also receive more money from these companies than any other members in Congress. In fact, a single one of these congressmen, his name is Dutch Ruppersberger, received over 350 grand from these companies alone. That's not all of his donations, that's just from these top 20 companies. So when we think about the revelations, when we think about the fact that we've learned what's going on, when we have an ability to debate it, when we have the ability to correct this overreach, when we have the ability to protest unconstitutional activities that never should have begun, but we also have a broader civic understanding of how our government works. We see that the most senior officials in government have been lying under oath. They've been making false statements to Congress, for example, James Clapper. But not just Congress. It's not just the lies we know of. There are other ones that didn't get as much attention. For example, the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General of the United States, he lied to the Supreme Court twice in writing, and it was in the New York Times. But this didn't become the front page news that persists and we respond to. But it was a direct revelation that came out on the newspaper on June 7th, was when we found out that people had been surveilled to dial back, because it gets technical in terms of surveillance authorities, what happened is the government was using warrantless surveillance to collect evidence to justify warrant applications for warranted surveillance. That's a violation of both the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment for people who are keeping score. And what's interesting is they didn't report this to the courts and they didn't report this to defendants. But then they later told the Supreme Court that they were. And it turned out that was untrue. If we don't know these kind of things, we don't know our government. We have to be able to know not just what governments do, but how they act in order to decide how closely we need to scrutinize their behaviors. And if we didn't have whistleblowers like you, like Tom Drake, and like everybody else who's come forward at tremendous risks, we would have a less open, less free, and less accountable society. And because of that, I think it's worth taking risks to do this. And it's not just what's illegal. You know, the scandal is what is legal. The scandal is what's happening every day, the unconstitutional activities that are still occurring right now. The fact that we look at, for example, one of the things that's been talked about a lot is how to fix this. The fact that the least controversial program in terms of do we end it, does this do nothing, is Section 215. And Section 215 of the Patriot Act basically says that, hey, we can collect the call records, metadata records from everybody in the country, regardless of whether they are suspected of any crime, any wrongdoing. And we have to ask, you know, what does that do? Why are they doing this? What is the value? Because if you encrypt communications, right, they don't get anything out of that. This is just the signaling records. This is like what a private eye collects. Who you meet, who you talk to, when it happened, where it was at, not the exact content of what was said during these calls. So encryption protects the content, but we forget about associations. And that's what this is about. These programs like Section 215, mass surveillance in general, is not about surveilling you. It's not about surveilling me. It's about surveilling us collectively. It's about watching the company that we keep for everybody in the country and on a global scale. This is basically a big data program which provides the raw data that can then be analyzed, it can be filtered, it can be subjected to rules, for example, like we see in this T-score, that says everything you do is being analyzed, it's being weighted, it's being measured, and that's without regard to whether or not you've done anything wrong. So when people say, you know, why does this matter? Well, why do I care? You know, why should I get up off the couch? It's because, again, when we think about this in terms of the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, you know, it's an unreasonable seizure because there's nothing to justify doing it. It happens in advance of any criminal suspicion. Or the due process violations under the Fifth Amendment, where the government is basically saying, we're going to use warrantless surveillance to collect evidence to then secretly use to get a warrant application. Or the First Amendment violations of our freedom to associate, right? Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, freedom of speech, or our right to associate, to enjoy the company of whoever we want. If you let go of your rights for a moment, you've lost them for a lifetime. And that's why this matters, is because it happened and we didn't know about it. We weren't told about it. In the post-September 11th period, we had programs stood up like Stellar Wind that collected all of our internet metadata, all of our calling metadata, and it was creating a massive, deep, robust data set that allows us to look at connections and actually programmatically analyze the connections of everybody at every place all the time. And I think that's not what this country is about. I think that's a fundamentally un-American thing. And I think we, the people, you in this room right now, have both the means and the capability to help build a better future by encoding our rights into the programs and protocols upon which we rely every day. And that's what a lot of my future work is going to be involved in. And I hope that you will join me in the Freedom of the Press and every other organization in making that a reality.
Good. Yeah, so I should mention both Dan Ellsberg and now Ed Snowden are on Freedom of the Press Foundation's board of directors, and we really want to make it our goal to help journalists and sources and everyone connect in a way that can be protected from the government's eyes and essentially protect our right to privacy and freedom of speech. And so I think that brings me to my next question for Ed, and this comes from one of the Ask Snowden questions on Twitter, is what specifically can designers and developers and others working in technology start to do to make things better? And are there specific examples out there that you would like to see people follow?
So when I talk about this, it's always difficult because it's entirely dependent on the threat model of the individual who's operating. Gam in the home has a different set of priorities than somebody who's working to report on the malfeasance of a deeply irresponsible government and an authoritarian regime. And so generally when I talk about this, I say encryption. I say encryption, 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 because it's an important first step that denies the government access to anything more typically than suspicion, which is drawn from association. But when we talk about how we fix this stuff for the future, we've got to realize that association is often the problem. It doesn't end at encryption, it starts at encryption. Because if you don't think about the links, sort of the signals that are happening, when I email you, and the government can't read the content of the communication, but they go, why is an employee of the government who was at work on Thursday at the Central Intelligence Agency or the National Security Agency or the FBI, who works on programs which would be deeply embarrassing to the government, why are they contacting someone at the Freedom of the Press Foundation or the Washington Post or the New York Times? And so we get tools like SecureDrop, which are good because they allow us to use mixed routing networks like Tor to sort of obfuscate our direct network path. But we've got to think about the fact that today, if people are connecting through a phone, that's not super helpful because the phone, for example, sees that you're connecting to Tor. It sees you're a Tor user. A good example of this, really a bad example in terms of OPSEC, is this recent American spy who was discovered in Germany. He was apparently, allegedly in the newspapers, spying for the United States against Germany. He then, I guess, wasn't satisfied with what was going on. So he said, hey, I'm going to shop myself to what I think are the Russians, because he got an email. He was using Gmail, by the way. Great OPSEC there. And he got an email that purported to be the Russian embassy. And they said, hey, you want to sell some documents? He said, oh, yeah, sure. And he sent them 3 classified documents. Now, this is an email. I don't know whether it's encrypted or not encrypted. That hasn't really been covered in detail. But the key is the adversary that was on the distant end of the communication, in this case, German counterintelligence for his model, although he's actually allegedly a spy. He's not interested in public interest. He's interested in money. Is the fact that when he did this, he was the only one who had access to these documents who was out of the office at the time. He took the day off to send this email. So again, we're not talking about the most sophisticated guy in the world, but this is the kind of thing you have to worry about in terms of how do governments discover their adversaries. And the same techniques they use to discover spies, they use to discover journalists. The Risen case and the Rosen case, both of these are journalists in the United States where, for example, the government was trying to get James Risen, New York Times reporter, to reveal his source, or they were subpoenaing an AP reporter, I believe, all of the phones in their office to say who from the government called the Associated Press. These are associational records. They didn't get the content of the calls, but they were trying to figure out what was going on. When we think about how we fix these programmatically, when we think about these in terms of protocols, we need to have protocols that are resistant to traffic analysis. They need to be padded, basically, even if there's some level of performance penalty. So you can't look at differences in, for example, Skype conversations and tell which phoneme or word was spoken based on packet size, the signaling speed, so on and so forth. You also need to use some sort of mixed routing, some sort of shared infrastructure that divorces the individual connection from the individual origination point. And that's still a hard problem. We haven't solved that in sort of a performance respecting manner. Tor does a really good job but Tor is also TCP only. It doesn't handle UDP, and a lot of other things like that. But this is something that's better to really get down and have everybody get in together, sort of red team it. Somebody pitches an idea, and the other people in the community, whether that's Twitter, whether that's a mailing list, they tear it down. It's the peer review model. That's how we do these things and we fix it. We need people to attack these systems. We need people to work as adversaries to try to find holes so we can fix them. And there's also the user experience issue. For example, GPG is robust and pretty reliable encryption. Unfortunately, it's damn near unusable. I mean, it's fine if you're comfortable with command line. It's fine if you're good with key management. But again, gam at the home is never going to be able to do that sort of thing. We need encryption, mixed routing. We need non-attributable communications or unattributable internet access, UIA, for example, that's available to people, that's easy, that's transparent, and that's reliable, that we can use not just here in the United States, but around the world, because again, this is a global problem. The National Security Agency, the FBI, these guys led the way because we've got the biggest budgets and we're the most aggressive when it comes to that kind of thing. But we're only the first. We're not the last. This is going to get a lot worse before it gets better. And we have to, you know, the grad students of the world have to be thinking about what they can do to fix this. They need to think in adversarial terms. They need to think about how are the worst people on earth going to try to subvert and break your system to not just damage individuals, but to damage governments, to shield themselves from oversight and accountability. And what can you do? What do you know? What can you think up to help shield us from that? And the techniques are only limited by our imagination.
Ed, a couple things. Okay. I hope people are taking notes here or in the darkness or texting the suggestions. He's giving you your marching orders. Okay.
They know this stuff. I don't know.
Suggest two things to me. I've got a lag here. I'll have to take this off. By the way, I have to say, with my hearing problem, the reverberation earlier before these was such that I missed a lot. I'm sorry, and I look forward to seeing a rebroad, on this on the web. I missed a lot of what Ed was saying. I'm sorry to say, but now I can with this. Not when I'm talking, though. There's a lag. Two things. We've been talking a lot about your people out here and Ed helping sources, which is of extreme importance, helping sources anonymously and without being attributable, get their information to journalists, to journalists essentially, and to the public, and to Congress, very possibly. For example, with the overhearing that we've just heard about, Feinstein by CIA, it's a real trick to get this stuff even to the Intelligence Committee, which is kind of a black hole for information anyway, but can't get it to them without the CIA knowing. There is also the problem there of going directly after journalists. And if this is what I was thinking, if you are successful in inspiring the people here to find ways of software that they can really use, with even as, I'm not even on Twitter, for example. At my age, it's enough to be on email. But easy to use. Then they need, right now, when they can find the sources and shut them off, that gives you your government-controlled press, a government press that is simply authorized information from the government, whether it's classified or not. They put out a lot of information that is classified because it supports their programs and their reputation and whatnot. So most leaks of classified information are actually authorized by an agency or a high official or whatnot. But supposing it becomes possible now for that handful of whistleblowers really to get the information in, then they would want to go after the bylined journalist who prints it. Now, so far, they have not done that. They accept the idea that the public will go along with prosecutions of officials who signed a non-disclosure agreement, as I did, or you did, and without really thinking of the fact that that agreement is not subject in corporations or elsewhere to criminal prosecution, to punishment by prison and whatnot. It's subject to a lot of other things like ostracism and losing your job, which is enough to keep people silent anyway. But supposing now that gets harder to do and they can't shut off all the sources. They haven't yet gone against the freedom of the press idea by directly prosecuting journalists. Assange, they have kept on ice here all the time with a grand jury going, with the threat basically that they're going to go after him on the grounds that he's not a real journalist, something like that. I mean, in-between person. But actually, of course, as you know, and I know, the people, Assange didn't do anything that could possibly really be prosecuted that wasn't also done by the New York Times and by the Guardian, by the Observer, which they're reluctant to go after. It's my opinion, I'm putting this to you, but my opinion that that lies next on the grounds that supposed journalist called Michael Kinsley accused Glenn Greenwald. And Peter King has done the same, and I think a number of others. And that is, you guys, you journalists, are aiding and abetting a crime, a criminal, with the assumption being from the beginning that the leaking is criminal. You know, I raised that question as to whether that should be regarded as constitutional to regard us as criminals. But if you do unequivocally regard us as criminals, and people like you, then the logic that people who are helping them get their information to the public are indeed helping, for sure, that's what they are doing. But aiding and abetting is a legal term, and it has to do with a crime. And perpetrating, wasn't it David Gregory who asked Greenwald, you know, insofar as you are aiding and abetting, he's saying, insofar as you are a criminal, why should you not be punished? So listening to you, I was really thinking, I didn't bring it out before, to accept that the giving the information is unequivocally criminal, is, I think, the first step almost surely to going along with the Kinsley and Gregory and so many others. Aiding and abetting, or rather helping, publishing, is also criminal. Seems logical, normal. And they will go after that as well. So I don't know, is that something you thought about or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really complex topic, and I think when we talk about whether or not the government begins going after journalists, this is the real sticking point for me, because in terms of my political philosophy as it relates to technology here, is I would say almost Stallman-esque. When we think about free software, we need to think about software as a means of expressing our freedom, but also defending our freedom. Governments rely on the same technologies we do. They adopt the same standards, they use the same products. And this happens worldwide. So the solution to that, when you ask me, is whether or not the United States government can manage to behave itself, to restrain itself against violating the Constitution, against bringing suits against journalists, against limiting the freedom of the press. Other governments will make different decisions. And if we want to live in a better, more enlightened world, what we need to do is we need to remove those capabilities from the governments by enshrining our rights into our means of communications, by denying them those capabilities, at least on a massive, untargeted level. Because, you know, you can't pitch a 0 day at every mobile phone, at every computer that's out there, or it's going to get caught. It's going to get caught by a researcher, and it's going to end up on, you know, The Verge, Ars Technica, or any one of these other sites. And there's going to be a post-mortem of their malware, and that's going to be reused and repurposed. They're going to find it out, and they're going to trace it back to you. But governments can still pursue their legitimate needs for law enforcement, for intelligence collection, on a targeted basis by using those 0 days only when they are the least intrusive and essential means of getting the intelligence that they require. But it sort of shuts them out of doing this on a broad social level where they target every journalist that's out there, you know, every news agency. And this is the way I think in the future we need to focus more and more toward how we do this. And when you talk about journalists like David Gregory, like Michael Kinsley, for the audience, if you haven't followed that story, Michael Kinsley argued basically that it was not the place of journalists to decide what the public should and should not know. His infamous quote was, "That decision as to what we, the public, should know must ultimately be made by the government." Some people can't be helped. But it's, the key there is that they are representing class interests, and we need to recognize them as a class, right? These journalists who are basically reflexively going to protect policies that are working against the public interest should not be trusted to inform us, right? We need to mark their names and remember what they're writing about. It's helpful that we get all these different views and, you know, they participate in the debate, they help inform us because we need that marketplace of ideas. But at the same time, when it's being done to actually limit debate, when they're saying these people shouldn't be able to make these points, these people shouldn't be able to publish these stories, this news should have never been news, we need to watch out for that because that's not ever going to benefit the public. That's making society, that's making government, that's making institutions necessarily less accountable. And it's a chilling effect that we need to watch out for. In terms of class interests, again, when we talk about how do we fix this, how do we patch these holes, Julian Assange made a plea at one point where he said, hackers of the world unite, sysadmins of the world unite. Anybody out there who, you know, posts on Stack Overflow, you know, the Stack Exchange, anywhere like that, you guys are part of the technical elite, right? If you've even heard of Tor or Tails or Unix or even OpenVPN, you know, hell, if you've even heard of Linux, you know, you are an advocate that is going to help us move forward in shifting the middle ground of technical literacy for the next generation, right? A lot of young people right now, they understand how technology works to an extent, but the system functions are hidden from them. They don't know where the dangers are, right? They don't know where their communications are exposed. They don't know how networking works. They trust their devices to handle everything. We all, any of us who know even the slightest bit, have a civic duty to help educate the people around us. Just like the rise of literacy, right? We had an obligation to teach people around us how to read and write. We have to teach people in our society how to interact with society, with technology, safely, reliably, and in a way that serves the interests of all of us, not just a select few. We don't want a high priesthood of technology, no matter how good that is for us, because it's bad for the world. And I think, I think, go ahead, Dan, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I was very struck by, something you said in Vanity Fair, the quote is accurate, which is that every one of us, I was very struck with every one of us, and I believe this is absolutely true, has known things that were wrong, saw things, has seen things that were wrong, that should be known, that should be exposed, and as you put it, we have turned our eyes away because we were intimidated. And I happened, you were speaking of yourself, speaking of myself, and come back to that, but I believe that's true of every human on earth, that there are times when they bite their tongues, they keep their mouths shut because to reveal it would lose a relationship, or in very private matters, or a job, or a career, whatever, and they've kept it. And then you said, but there comes a time, you know, when the level of inhumanity or the wrongness is so great that you have to cross over that line, as you said, and you said, I crossed over that line. Now, to tell, after all. Now, I thought when I read that, that's Edward Snowden who did that. And that's Chelsea Manning. And how many others? When you said there comes a time when you, very generally, cross over that line and tell the truth, even at cost to your relationships, to your boss, to your friends, to your everything else. Most people, I have to say, never do reach that line. They never do reach a point when they decide to take a risk of their own status and their own relationships and their own job. And the test of that is that many of them have been tested on things like the continuation of a wrongful war. Thousands of lives, hundreds of thousands. In the case of tobacco, as I said, 500,000 lives a year lost by tobacco? Look at GM right now, it's a handful, but you know, striking, where they deliberately covered up. Covered up is not only in the how many people at GM knew that lives were being lost and people were being injured? And who spoke out? Nobody, I don't think so. Tobacco, 2 people, Merrill Wigan. One thing that I hope from you, Ed, from your example, is that more people will be inspired to take even significant risks. In other words, we're talking, you and I and the whole group here, about lowering the risks for people. And that's undoubtedly essential. But in the end, there will always be a risk, as you say, endpoint problems and so forth. And the willingness to take that risk for civilians is very rare. It was, as you may know, it was Bismarck, of all people, who said, civil courage, he almost invented that phrase, civil courage, is very, he only said courage on the battlefield is very common in our country, our Prussian country at that point. He says, but civil courage is another matter. It's very rare, this willingness to risk. Now, as I said before Manning and before you, I'd virtually I have to say I'd almost given up on it. And you're showing an example now. Manning didn't get the, he got a lot of attention, but he didn't get the effect in this country, except, as I've said earlier, for getting our troops home from Iraq, that you did. And why? Because I think in Manning's case, he was showing what we were doing to other people in the third world, foreigners, others, not us. And you, and actually, in my case, was the effect because of the millions of Vietnamese that were being killed wrongly? Every one of them is wrong. When I read the Pentagon Papers and realized that for the first time, that the very beginning we were supporting a French colonial reconquest of a country, which I thought of as un-American, whether it was illegal internationally or not. I saw every death in Vietnam as being unjustified homicide. And to me, that was murder, mass murder, and I couldn't be part of that anymore. So I changed. Well, the American people didn't respond, I'm sorry to say, on the whole, except for people in audiences like this, to the mass murder, but there were 58,000 Americans in the process of dying then, see? And in your case, again, it wasn't so much directly dying, but what was being done to us, and people are objecting to that. So I think we have to have a different standard, and you show the possibility of it. Your colleagues in NSA, as you've said, agreed with you, many of them. This is wrong, it shouldn't be happening, but I have a mortgage, I have a marriage, I have, you know, this and that, children to go to college, and that was enough. Even though we're talking about this massive, you know, intrusion, which is a new world, basically, that people need to know about. So it shouldn't be only you. I would hope that some of your colleagues who I would suspect, let me give you a little piece of experience from my experience. If you were in a room with your former colleagues now, I would expect them to leave that room. And they would not be in touch with you. If you can tell me that a former colleague from NSA has in any way communicated with you to say you did the right thing, or in any way, I would guess there was 0 on that. That was my experience at the Rand Corporation. You lose every friend you have who has a clearance. That's all your friends. So, but you're not made of sugar, as you've shown. You can deal with that. I saw you say yesterday, wasn't it in the paper? If I'm in chains in Guantanamo, I can live with that. Well, that didn't surprise me, Ed. That's the person I find you to be. That was not a surprise to me. It's a pretty unusual statement, you know, after all, isn't it? Well, let's make it a little less unusual. You went in the special forces, tried to get, and had your legs broken, so forth, didn't go with it. I used my Marine training in Vietnam as a civilian. I had been a Marine company commander in peacetime. And so I used that training in Vietnam. So I saw combat. I walked with troops in combat. There you see courage, physical courage, every minute, every day. People doing the job or trying to save their comrades. That kind of courage is marvelous. As a Marine once said at Tarawa, uncommon courage was a common virtue. Okay, right. When you're doing it for the boss, for the commander-in-chief, with the applause of your country, even if you don't get the applause. Most of it is anonymous. But you know they would approve you if they knew of it, what they were doing, and they would hold you accountable if you didn't do it. We should have a different standard than we do for our civilian officials. And not just official, you know, I don't know if you regarded yourself as an official, but a middle-level person. It shouldn't be simply that you are the extraordinary hero that we thank. It should be that we should ask the question of those other people. What made you think you could keep this secret that long? Keep it totally, keep your mouths. A lot of blood has flowed because people bit their tongues and swallowed their whistles and didn't speak out. And it's time, I think, that we not prosecute them, but tell them that is not the way to preserve a democracy. You are not fulfilling your oath. And I'll just end by saying, people ask, as I used to be, is he patriot or traitor? You know, that's the headline and all these things. Edward Snowden, patriot, traitor. That drives me nuts. The very thought, you know, that people could regard you as a traitor. The ignorance of the media and the Congress people and the interviewers who raise that question offends me as an American, that they think that it can be traitorous to tell the truth to your fellow countrymen. But it's terrible. Here's the standard I would like to see set. I'm sure the standard I would like to see set. Snowden was the one person in the fucking NSA who did what he absolutely should have done. How many people should have done what you did? Chelsea Manning. I said this about Chelsea when it came out, and I say it now. Patriot or traitor, said we all took the same oath to uphold and defend the Constitution. I've already said there are people who violate it all the time, thousands. There are people who are against it, like Cheney and some others. But when it comes to upholding that oath, no one in the U.S. military services, up to the commander-in-chief, has fulfilled her oath to defend and support the Constitution like Chelsea Manning, and no one in the U.S. executive branch, in any branch, has fulfilled your oath, the oath to uphold and support the Constitution as well as you. So thank you.
That's high praise. I would, I'm still politically very moderate. You know, I think it's funny, the very first time I met Glenn Greenwald, sort of the lead journalist that I talked to in Hong Kong, he called me a radical. And that was a surprise to me because that was the first time I had ever been called a radical. But he didn't mean it in a bad way.
He called you what? Say it again.
A radical. A political.
Radical action. Radical action.
Right. But the key is, I think there are so many people throughout the government, throughout the country, who are trying to do the right thing. But as you said, there is this burden, this compulsion, this operational inertia, where they feel, you know, we talked about this in the office, people who saw this was wrong, who agreed this was wrong, who were disturbed by it, and who felt we needed to do something. But at the same time, we all have families. We all have mortgages. We all have lives. We all have things we want to do, things we want to enjoy.
As you did. You did too.
Right, right. I mean, I loved Hawaii. Everybody, you know, I don't have to say I love my family. But you put those things at risk. And I knew the highest possibility of when I walked out of the office in Hawaii on the last day was that I would never make it out of the airport. But I accepted that because I knew that, as you said earlier, we all have a limit to the level of incivility, of inhumanity we can see and do nothing about. And when you cross that line, you have to do something. But at the same time, we can't judge people too harshly for human nature. If people have a different analysis, a different weighting of the risk, at least for me, what's important for us is not to condemn them, but to enable them, to empower them. I don't want to take a negative stance of judging them and saying, you didn't do what you were supposed to do. You didn't do what you swore you would do. Even if that is the case, I think of it from an engineer's perspective and go, how can we fix it? How can the people in this room reduce the costs to action? How can the people in this room, how can the people around the world, how can anybody who's seen what's happened in the last year, what thoughts do you have about how we can make sure we get the truth of what our governments are doing? That we have a seat at the table of government, regardless of how authoritarian our government, regardless of what their response would be, because when they do something wrong, we will know about it. And they won't know who told the world about it. And critically, this is the thing. This is not about anarchy. This is not about, wiping out government. This is about saying when governments realize that when they do unlawful things, when they do unconstitutional things, or when they do things that are entirely legal but comprehensively immoral, we will find out about it. That will change the world. That will change the way we live. Because the problem today is when you bring, a case when the system we have today is secret agencies operating under secret policies, secret interpretations of laws, overseen by secret courts, rubber stamp courts, who in 35 years have said no only 13 times out of 35,000. When that's the way it goes, and they're overseen by these congressmen who are getting their pockets stuffed full of dollars by these intelligence contracting companies, what the government has done, when we look at this, any one of those steps in isolation, the fact that it takes 10 years to get this heard in an open court, at the Supreme Court instead of a secret court, when we look at what that is in isolation, any step, it might look like clever lawyering by the government. But when we look at it comprehensively, what it is the government has developed an exploit chain that provides basically the root password to our Constitution. They've escaped the sandbox of our democracy, and they're basically using it to change our Bill of Rights without us seeing it. And when we go, what does the Bill of Rights say? The rootkit is telling us, oh, well, the Fourth Amendment's still there. But in reality, it's gone. Something completely different is happening behind the scenes. And we can't allow that. And the only way we can stop that from being sort of a retrospective action where we go back and investigate and try to figure out who did something wrong, who we should hold to account, is we have to make sure we stop it before it happens. And the only way that's going to happen is if we have transparency and we have accountability for the senior officials who fucked up in the first place.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, very good. First of all, let me say I agree. I understand what you're saying. Don't condemn these people, or that isn't the important thing. But you and I aren't talking. We're having a real discussion here because we do have a somewhat different focus, and I happen to think that both approaches are important. Let me distinguish. Actually, when I keep mentioning this 40 years between 1973, when my trial ended, in 2013, when you came out, that was 40 years, or 71, 2010, and so forth. I, in fact, came to feel that I was apparently just asking too much. That somehow, you keep saying, everybody has a limit. And what I was seeing was, no, a few people have a limit. And most of them have no, by the way, as you said, there's no question, at all times, there are people in the system who are criticizing, who are raising questions, who are even, saying this is wrong or whatnot, up to a point, as you did before, you went all the way and talked to other people. But their limit is going outside channels, going to the public, that limit doesn't get crossed. They're taking a risk even complaining or criticizing, some of them. And they may even lose their jobs as a result eventually, but they get another job as long as they haven't broken that promise to keep their mouth shut about anything. See, they can get another job then. They can be trusted.